and welcome. I'm delighted to have you join us for today's discussion, which is called the Cracking the Code, Go-to-Market Strategies for Niche Regulated Products. So this event is hosted by SPARK, a BARDA-funded accelerator hub that focuses on advancing innovations to protect pediatric and special populations against health security threats. I'm going to introduce the panel very briefly, but then I'm going to ask them to talk more about their successful device that was brought to the market and their role currently. So I'm thrilled to be joined by three outstanding panelists who have each successfully brought to market a product and led their companies through a successful acquisition. Chris Mataya, former CEO of Inara Health, acquired by Cardinal Health. Jules Sherman, principal at JS Design Group, creator of Primo Lacto, which was acquired by Lensino. And Ken Nelson, former chief commercial officer of BARDA Diagnostics, acquired by Hillrom, now Baxter. Each of them brings a unique perspective on navigating regulatory hurdles, gaining clinical adoption, and building companies that attracted strategic partners. So I have a question that I'm going to start asking of all of the panelists, and that is, could each of you briefly share the biggest challenge you faced in bringing your product to market and the pivotal decision that helped you move forward? And please briefly describe your device, your successful device, and also your current role. I will start with Ken.
Sure. Yeah. Ken Nelson, partner and co-founder in MedTech Advantage Fund, which is a fund on top of MedTech Innovator, which is one of the bigger, or actually the biggest med device digital health startup accelerators globally. And prior to that, led commercialization efforts and launched all the patch products for iRhythm first, then biotelemetry, and then BARDA, all three of which either went public or got acquired. The most recent was BARDA Diagnostics, and that's where Kalali and I got to know each other. I think the biggest hurdle we faced in early commercialization, probably like a lot of the more recent startups, was COVID. And obviously that created all kinds of different challenges. And I think two of the big things that we did to overcome the challenges of COVID, one, had to make the difficult decision to, within probably 6 weeks, 5 or 6 weeks or so after the real COVID emergency started, which was probably mid March of 2020, decided to do two really critical things that helped our success. One was to get back on airplanes and start going into hospitals again, and lead from the front. I felt as chief commercial officer, if I was going to ask our sales reps and leadership to do it, I needed to do it myself, and I was going to be the first one to get on a plane and go into hospitals. So that was the first critical decision. And then second, I was not a social media person at all prior to COVID. Not on Facebook, still not on Facebook, but I decided to get very active on LinkedIn and have remained very active on LinkedIn. But I think that the combination of those two things really helped us stay connected with not only our internal team, but also with customers and investors. So I think those were the two big things that helped us get through COVID.
Thank you so much, Ken. Jules, do you want to follow?
Sure. Yeah. My name is Jules Sherman. I'm the principal of JS Design Group and adjunct professor at the University of Maryland Bioengineering Department. I was the founder of Maternal Life, where I developed Primo Lacto, which is a closed system for colostrum collection. So it's a product to help mothers who are unable to breastfeed directly after birth collect their colostrum and get that fed to their infant. I think the biggest challenges I faced bringing my product to market were both in the business bucket. So first, protecting my IP from a large player in the space who filed IP very soon after we had signed an NDA and I had presented my innovation. And then two, negotiating the final acquisition terms was very tough for me to do as an individual on my own because I was emotionally, tied to the product. So I needed help with that kind of negotiation and got help from a co-inventor to do those negotiations, a co-inventor and also an attorney.
Thank you, Jules. And Chris?
Sure. Chris Mathia. I'm the former CEO of Inara Health. Inara Health's solution called the N-Trainer helped preterm infants develop the skill, the suck, swallow, breathing skill set necessary to make that transition from feeding tubes to breast or bottle. Today, after the transaction to Cardinal Health, I immediately began working with BioHealth Innovation as an entrepreneur in residence to support ARPA-H and BARDA clients on commercialization planning. I then moved in to help a great company that received FDA breakthrough designation on a human milk concentration device. And finally ended up as the CEO of a company called Therapy, where I'm currently at now, which we have a phototherapy device for neonatal jaundice. It's more of a swaddle than it is an overhead device. From a challenges perspective, I'm unlike Jules and Ken, maybe a little bit more like Ken. I came in to the CEO role from a sales perspective. I came to Inara to stand up sales, moved into the CEO role, and immediately was hit in the face with how hard it is to raise capital for pediatrics. Fortunately, I had a great board, and I had some tremendous investors that kept Inara afloat so that I could go deal with, like Ken said, COVID. You can imagine access to the NICU during COVID was non-existent. But once inside the NICU, we had a challenge that our device was not reimbursed. So I immediately needed to understand what is the value proposition that can outweigh a lack of reimbursement. And from a pediatrics perspective, it's how do we give these kiddos their healthiest trajectory from a health perspective once they leave the hospital. So understanding, and we'll probably answer a couple of these more in detail with additional questions, but looked at pricing, looked at our value proposition, and really weighed those against what our clients were telling us and created a different go-to-market strategy that helped propel Inara to an exit in 2023.
Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you for sharing those experiences. So once you face those early hurdles, the next big step is often convincing others that your product is worth believing in. So my question to all of you is, we know that early adopters are critical. How did you build credibility with clinicians, health systems, and payers, and especially when the market was skeptical or untested?
I can take that one first. I think one of the things that we did, and honestly, I think part of it was luck finding out about these pitch competitions that were somewhat tied to MedTech Innovator and Clay. That's where we first met, were the Pediatric Device Innovation Consortium pitch competitions. And I think one of the years it was even focused on pediatric cardiology innovation. And so going and pitching at those events, and there were a couple of them across the country, and then South by Southwest also had a pediatric health innovations pitch competition. And going there, we got exposure to some of the biggest pediatric institutions across the country. So first was raising awareness about what we were doing. Second was trying to get people to use it on pediatric patients and get the pediatric indication, or an indication where they could be used on pediatrics. And those were instrumental in us getting key opinion leaders in pediatrics to use the technology, and then kind of snowball effect from there. If it works and works well, they'll talk to their colleagues. They'll start to publish papers on it. They'll start to talk about it at pediatric device um, industry events. And so that I think that was really instrumental for us, A, in raising awareness that it could be used with pediatrics, and B, also getting some research funding. We were fortunate enough to win some of those pitch events.
Thank you. Thank you, Ken. Chris, do you want to follow Ken?
Sure. Ken, we had the same experience with MedTech Innovator, and I actually got to meet Kalale before MedTech Innovator and was included into the NCCPDI's portfolio of clients, which just gave me access to a number of experts from Children's National and beyond. From a credibility perspective, we took a little bit of a different approach because we were in market. And as many of the folks on this call recognize, there's a handful of high-profile NICUs across the country and health systems as well. And I focused specifically on a small subset of those systems and those NICUs, one of which was Kaiser Permanente. Kaiser was important to Inara's trajectory because as a provider payer, the reimbursement piece wasn't necessarily as big of an issue, and it was more about the clinical outcomes. And I think Kaiser is also recognized as an efficient operation. So understanding if I could pull success out of Kaiser, that would certainly
have
translate.
someone to go to help,
that would certainly translate to not just that Southern California geography, but across the country as well. So we really focused a significant amount of effort on clients like Kaiser, like Children's of Orange County, like UPMC. And once we were able to prove, hey, there's value being delivered out of this device, that informed our conversations with every other NICU that we walked into, having had credibility of it's performed at these high-profile NICUs. There's certainly an opportunity where you could extract that same level of value. We can get into it maybe in another question, but our pricing model was something that needed to be overhauled as well. And understanding that the more babies this was being used on, the more likely we were going to have elements of success that we could capture, turn into white papers, and then use from a credibility building standpoint.
Thank you so much, Chris. Jules?
Yeah, so when I began developing Primo Lacto, I was actually a graduate student at Stanford, and so was able to have access to and seek feedback from neonatologists and an OBGYN at Lucille Packard Children's to get, feedback on the product as it developed. And so they were seeing me working on this product pretty diligently, and they ended up connecting me to their peers nationwide. And this allowed me to build, lasting relationships and build credibility with kind of a large number of clinicians all over the country. And then eventually those clinicians became my champions for Primo Lacto. And then learning about the PDC and, getting the opportunity to pitch the product and win funding for the product to develop it even more really added to the credibility of the product so that I could, continue my activities with testing in hospitals, have the funding to do that, and then also have the funding to build the product, at a very high fidelity to test in a hospital. So all of that kind of helped with, credibility and getting it out there for people to see and appreciate. So I'd boil it down to really building relationships over time with people who care about the problem that you're working on. So if you're a student, and you have access to a hospital near your university, definitely use your student status to get to get those introductions and to meet people who care about the problem that you're working on.
Thank you so much, Jules. Great insights. So now that you've built some credibility among users of the products, at the end of the day, everything boils down to financials and making sure that the economics make sense. Can you share your experiences with respect to your interactions with payers, alternative models such as working with the GPO or perhaps CMS innovation model? Share what you learned along the way and what strategies you implemented with respect to health economics and reimbursement.
Yeah, I'll jump in since mine's probably the shortest of the responses. From a payer perspective, the response, even going to my state Medicaid director, was we can certainly give guidance, but we can't force hospitals down a path to advocate for a device. But if you want to get our attention, then let's start to look at outcomes and partnering with your hospitals to understand what those outcomes look like, which was that's a long process, which we took on. But in the meantime, we were also part of a GPO that gave us a license to hunt, and that certainly is one of those immediate disqualifiers if somebody's trying to keep you out of the hospital, that they would certainly use to limit your access. Given that we weren't necessarily a commodity and we're not driving a significant amount of revenue for the GPOs, you can appreciate we probably don't get a lot of attention, but certainly was always a phone call away and gave us the access to a large swath of hospitals that again added to our credibility.
Ken, would you like to follow on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think the more interesting one would be with iRhythm, the first patch company that I commercialized. With that one, we didn't have the reimbursement code for more extended patch monitoring. This was a 14-day cardiac patch monitor, really the first on the market. And so we were up against the traditional 24-hour Holter monitoring codes and some of the other like event monitoring codes where we didn't really fit into either of those categories. We were a continuous monitor that was capturing every beat for up to 14 days. And so initially there was no reimbursement code. We went after a new CPT code. So in that process, we needed to get commercial payers that would back that up and eventually get reimbursement for, and same with Medicare. And so part of the process was getting the clinical evidence we need, so the clinical studies that we needed to get that payer coverage for that new code. The other part was getting physician advocates and societies to write letters on behalf of the company advocating for this new reimbursement code. And what I'll say is you want to start that process really early because it's going to take a long time. You first typically will get what's known as a Category 3 code. The advantage, and there's advantages and disadvantages to that. The advantages are that you get payer coverage, so there's coverage decision for Medicare. What you don't get is a national fee schedule. So you have to go to each of the individual Medicare MACs. I think at the time there were 14 of them around the country, and each individual MAC would price it out if they agree to give you a rate, and you can get a rate. So that's just a really long, drawn out process, but that's one way to go. And then the goal is to eventually transition from a Category 3 code to a Category 1 code. In the case of iRhythm, the Category 3 code got renewed either 2 or 3 times. So this got pushed out, which was atypical for almost 10 years before it was a Category 1 code. I think that in the case of iRhythm, that also helped them get pretty decent reimbursement over time. But more traditionally, I think within roughly 3 years or so, we'll transition to Category 1. And when it goes to Category 1, you get a national fee schedule, so you don't have to get individual rates from each of the individual MACs. But that it takes a lot of time and effort to do that. You've got to get lots of letters of support from the different industry societies and individual physicians, and then you have to have the right reimbursement coverage. But at the end of the day, it does work. And in the case of iRhythm, they're the second biggest player in the space today, and it had a highly successful IPO. So it can really pay off if you put the time and effort in and can get a new code for your product.
Thank you. And maybe a follow-up, since Chris and Ken, you both elaborated on this question so far. Were there any point in time that you decided to pivot from a CapEx model to an OpEx model? And at what point, that pricing decision became so important?
Yeah, I'll jump in, Ken, if you're all right with that.
Yeah.
So again, as an operator, I came in and I inherited a pricing model that it was very difficult for hospitals to track it and to budget for it, just given the fluctuations from a census perspective. I contemplated early on moving from a CapEx model to an operational/subscription model, because earlier I had mentioned I need my device used on as many babies as possible. And one of our board members gave me some profound advice that if you're going to try to change, if you're attempting to change a standard of care, you can't let price be a barrier. So understanding that this was new into a clinician's workflow, that it was a brand new market, and there was an existing workflow to manage something like the nTrainer. We needed to incent NICUs to use it on more patients without having to incur additional costs. So we introduced a monthly flat fee subscription model. Use it on as many patients as you can. We understood that there's some physics on just how many patients you can use it on. But that process uncovered patients that fell outside of our normal patient population, that when the device worked, it worked incredibly well. And in some cases, avoiding surgeries, avoiding G-tube placements, helping mom and dad connect with the baby and understand feeding cues, and then just give concrete information on how important feeding was and the developmental milestones when you make that transition to breast or bottle, and that's what's keeping you in the NICU. There was just a windfall of opportunities and success stories that came out of transitioning from a CapEx to a subscription model that really helped us grow our footprint.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I'm glad you asked it, Kalali. When I was brought into BARDA Diagnostics at CCO, they had already been trying to commercialize the product and were really struggling. And I was lucky that I had the experience of having commercialized what have become the two biggest players in the space. So I had the ups and downs and the roller coaster ride of trying to do that 2 other times before, and it had learned what worked with customers and what didn't. And when I came into BARDA, they were really trying to sell the patches as a medical device and sell the software as a one standalone technology, and have the hospital or the clinic do all the work themselves. And then a subset would outsource it, but they didn't have their own what's called an IDTF, independent diagnostic testing facility. But coming in, what I had known and having had to do this before in this space, that 80% of the market didn't want to buy the capital equipment. They didn't want to buy the patches and didn't want to buy the software. They would rather outsource that part of the business to a third party IDTF, have them do it, and then each party bill the payers directly for the components that they were responsible for. And in those scenarios, it was called split billing. No dollars exchanged hands between the company and the hospital or the clinic. It was split billing, so each party would bill their specific components to the payers or to Medicare. And so I had to convince the board and the leadership team to change their mindset completely. And that, yes, we had built a really unique medical device that we felt was better than anything on the market, but we weren't a medical device company. Even though we built a device, we weren't a device company. And I need to get them to change their mindset that we built a great device, but we were really a diagnostic services company, and that device was used to perform the service, and that really we should be giving those devices to perform the service, and then each party should build their own part of the diagnostic service, which is how 80% of the industry, the customers wanted to do it. And once we made that shift and decided to acquire an IDTF, it changed our commercialization completely. So instead of really being able to go after 20% of the overall market, we could now offer both options and go after 100% of the market. And so our commercialization efforts really started to take off after we changed that mindset, changed our way of commercializing, and just having the company change their overall way of thinking about what kind of company we were. But until we made that significant shift, we really struggled commercially. So that's an important learning point. Sometimes you just have to pivot or really dig into how the competition does business and the options that they offer, because you may think you're going down the right path, but you end up struggling if you don't shift your business model.
Fascinating, very important. Thank you both, Chris and Ken, for adding that insight. Jules, I know that you've had some experience with a GPO. Maybe briefly describe, from your perspective, at what point you decided that, you wanted to go on your own as your salesperson or going with a GPO?
Yeah, in terms of the GPO experience, I was invited to present the product to a GPO. They had a panel of like 20 clinicians that was reviewing my product. They unanimously selected the product to be part of a catalog that would help, get it in front of value analysis teams and hospitals. But then I had to pay for that to be in the catalog, for my product to be in the catalog. And then I had to pay on top of that a percent to the GPO for sales. And so I decided just to continue on without that kind of support, because I knew that I didn't really want to be in the manufacturing and sales business. I did want to get the product acquired by a larger company who already had that infrastructure in place.
Thank you so much. So Jules, I wanted to start with you for the next question, which is related to design. Building credibility among clinicians important. Have to make sure that hospitals understand the economics and everything makes financial sense. But at the end of the day, if the device, the product is not usable, that can make or break the deal. And you're such a great expert in product design. Can you talk about your approach to product design and some of the pitfalls that companies should avoid?
Yeah, so we know design thinking is like a human-centered and an iterative approach to problem solving. So that's where I start, is at the center is the human who's actually going to be using the product. And at the time I was first developing Primo Lacto, I was at Stanford actually learning a lot about human-centered design. And so I was applying what I was learning to this entrepreneurial endeavor. You know, Primo Lacto, first of all, began as an attempt to solve a problem I personally encountered in the hospital when a nurse was unable to retrieve colostrum I had pumped because it was stuck in the valve. So, you know, it started with me, but then what happened was because I was in school, I had access to a group called Stanford Parent Net, and I also had a mother's group. So I was bringing my ideas to these two groups and getting feedback and iterating on the product over and over. In addition, getting feedback from the clinicians at Lucille Packard. So it's really like they call it participatory design in the qualitative research world, where I was getting input from a lot of different people and then bringing back more prototypes for them to look at. So it's really a co-creation with users. And of course, I was also a user myself. So I understood the problem very deeply with a lot of empathy. So that I think, that's really what design thinking is all about is, even if you haven't had the problem yourself, to really get deep into the research and understand the people who will be using your product and who you're aiming to serve.
Thank you, Jules. Chris, would you like to talk about your experience with redesign, perhaps?
Sure. So obviously we're in the NICU, and the NICU is often fairly confined, whether it's bays or individual rooms. And our device, which received 510K clearance in 2008, hadn't really materially been improved since receiving 510K. And if you, imagine a microwave stacked on top of a college dorm refrigerator, that's about the form factor that the original N-trainer was in, which made it very difficult for clinicians to fit it into their workflow, an already difficult workflow. So the idea behind the redesign was let's make the necessary improvements that allow for a more efficient use from a workflow standpoint. I believe that if we looked at what were our biggest challenges from an adoption perspective, it wasn't necessarily the device, even though the smaller footprint and the efficiencies of the next generation device were great. It's understanding workflow and understanding how clinicians navigate their day-to-day, and does your device offer enough value that there would be a change to their workflow. So that was really what incented the redesign of the device, and then the resubmission to the FDA for 510K approval.
And you submitted to the FDA, to err on the side of caution for, I remember that our consortium was advising you to do that, but at the end, it did not need a new clearance application, so which was good news.
Yeah. I may be one of, and I actually have the letter here in my desk drawer that we received from the FDA the day after Thanksgiving, that we did not need to resubmit for 510K clearance because we weren't materially changing the way the therapy is delivered. So I'll hold on to that one for a while.
Good. That's awesome. Ken, anything you would like to add?
Yeah, sure. So it's interesting. I've been involved with commercializing a couple different companies in the same space, and I'm now on the board of one in that particular space. And I can tell you, over time, being someone who liked to be in the field and meeting directly with customers and hearing the feedback of what worked and what didn't and what their pain points were. With iRhythm, it was originally a non-real-time, meaning didn't talk to a smartphone patch. So patient would wear it, they'd put it into the US mail and send it back. Then the iRhythm would review the data and send a report back to the physician. So it'd take a period, and that's still their core product today, but it would take some time before the physician could see the data on the patient. And that's good for a good percentage, significant percentage, majority of patients that need cardiac monitoring, but discovered there was a subset of patients where real-time patch monitoring would work. At the time, the leadership of iRhythm didn't agree that that was the case. And so I went to another company that was doing real-time monitoring with wired products and said, hey, we should bring a patch that talks to a smartphone to market. And that was with CardioNet, which became biotelemetry. And so we co-developed this product that could talk to a smartphone for a subset of the patient population. And so that's one of their core products today is their mobile cardiac telemetry patch, which is used on patients where you need more of a real-time response. So think about patients who are passing out or cryptogenic stroke patient where you want to find that AFib and anticoagulate the patient right away to prevent that secondary stroke. And then further, as time developed, and now I'm on the board of a company, you determine that patient or physicians wanted a multi-parameter device that not only had cardiac monitoring capabilities, but also incorporated other vital signs monitoring, as well as wanting more than one or two leads on the ECG. So a company called Smart Cardia out of Switzerland, which does 7 lead real-time ECG monitoring, but also incorporates other vital signs in so you can start to monitor other chronic conditions other than just arrhythmias. And so you kind of learn over time and then redesign the products to meet the needs of the market. And so it's been interesting to be a part of these different companies in the space and see how they redesign the products to compete and gain share in the market.
Thank you very much, Ken. To everyone who is listening, please, if you have any questions, type it in the Q&A box. And at the end, Kamran will moderate the Q&A for us. Thank you so much. Great. Now, let's talk about scaling and your exit strategy. Could you share what was the one most important factor for your acquirer that attracted and led them to make the decision to acquire your company and your product, in your case, Jules?
In my case, it was definitely the clinical pilot study done at 3 different hospitals, the data.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. Ken and Chris, could you also elaborate on that? I know that in the case of, Ken BARDA Diagnostics, you grew the company and the sales force from very small to very large. And in your case, Chris, you were the CEO and CCO and everyone in one person. So talk about, scaling up and bringing the company to a point that it became so attractive. And what was that one thing that was so attractive to the acquirer?
Yeah, I'm happy to start there. I mean, unfortunately, coming into BARDA, sometimes you hire a group of people that you think might be the right group to commercialize the product based on the prior companies that the people may have been involved with. In the case of BARDA, a lot of the people came from Cameron Health, which was the subcutaneous ICD, an implantable device. So they brought on salespeople who would be great for an implantable device, but not necessarily the right sales rep profile to sell a diagnostic service like the BARDA cardiac monitoring patch. And so I had to make the tough decision to replace a lot of those people with the right profile that I knew was successful, having built 2 other companies in that space. So I had to start there. So assessing the group that they had, letting a lot of those people go, unfortunately, and starting over. So sometimes you have to make the difficult decision to hire a totally different profile of rep, and then making sure that you target the right geographic areas for your first initial hires to be successful. So looking at where the biggest populations are for patients that or physicians that prescribe that type of test. And you can buy this data from groups like Definitive Health, where you can get the Medicare claims data, and in some cases you can buy commercial patient claims data to help with targeting where to find the top target physicians for your to be your customers. And then you start to build the right sales team, build the right culture, and that team becomes really, really important to the overall success and scaling of the company. But along the way, you've really got to continue to raise awareness in order to drive that adoption. So you need to be at all the industry events. You need to be pitching at the different available startup and fundraising events and industry events, and just getting the name of the company and awareness of the product out there, which just takes a lot of time and effort, and then getting physicians to do either case studies or clinical studies or abstracts to be talking about your technology at the industry events. And in the case of BARDA, we went from a couple hundred patients a month when I started to 3 years later, we were doing 20,000 patients a month. And that was all based on the great team of people that we brought together, the culture that we built, and the physicians who were willing to take a chance on us early on, and then continued to be users and talk about us at industry events. And I think that rapid adoption really helped us with not only fundraising, but becoming attractive to acquirers. And what I'll tell you is, if you were to tell me that Hillrom was going to be the acquirer of the company when I started, I would have never guessed that Hillrom would have been on the list. And so you may have the traditional acquirers who you think might be the company that's going to acquire yours, but don't, have an open mind that other people might want to get into the space, or they may change their corporate initiatives and focus and start to get into the area that you're in. And so don't rule those other peripheral potential acquirers out, because in the case of BARDA, one of those companies that I would have never guessed would have been the acquirer ended up being the acquirer of the company.
Yeah, we have a little bit of a different approach, and I would assume that a lot of the folks on the call are small organizations trying to break in. From a Cardinal perspective, Cardinal was interested in the white space, and we had created a market on feeding development, and there was a strategic initiative for Cardinal to continue to move into the neonatal intensive care unit. And given that we had made some significant progress with one of their largest clients, it was a pretty easy decision. It was an easy process, but it was an easy decision from that standpoint. From a scale perspective, I can tell you firsthand that I am a connoisseur of Marriott's concierge lounge dinners, and I've had more of those out of necessity than I care to admit. But there was something about me being the tip of the spear from a sales perspective. We went down the path of looking at a distributor, and outside of the expense of the margin leakage, which in some instances was extreme, I just wasn't comfortable being another tool in a bag of 20 tools.
Yeah.
Another element of me being out front is the lessons that I learned were easily translatable to our two clinical specialists. One was a speech and language pathologist. The other one was a NICU nurse. And I needed them not to act like salespeople, because the second you act like a salesperson, you're going to get treated like one. So it was a process of me going out, understanding that maybe a hospital in the Pacific Northwest or in San Francisco doesn't really care about reduction in length of stay. And like Jules, our clinical evidence was significant. And that was somewhat of the way that I would get through the door. But then understanding that doesn't resonate for every hospital depending on payer mix. So then it informed my process of, okay, well, let's look at payer mix before I walk into a hospital, because LSU Health Sciences is different than one of the Sutter Health facilities in San Francisco. And understanding how to tailor those value propositions helped us gain market share. And it was small, but it was that market share that, if you go back to the original question on being able to show credibility with some of the largest and most recognizable health systems, that's what was going to inform and fuel our growth. But that's also what was attractive to Cardinal when they looked at what their initiatives were and what we were doing from a product market fit perspective. But and then I'll also say the last piece is, the titles are meaningless, right? They may help you get some meetings, and in which case they'd help me get some meetings, but opening mail, paying bills, moving stuff to the doctor. There's only six or seven of us at the most. Knowing what our ultimate goal was and being out there in the forefront with our clients was really, I think, one of the key differentiators for us, because I knew that when my feet hit the ground, that's what I was thinking about. And everybody was operating on the same page with what our big, audacious goal was. And knowing that if we continue to get at bats, we're going to get more clients. And when we get more clients, it gives us the ability to go out and raise more money, seek optionality from an acquisition perspective, and really do what's right, not just by the kiddos that we serve, but by our investors as well.
Thank you so much. I want to move to a question that is very general, not specific to your companies, but from your experience being in a niche market, working on pediatric products. What do you think? What is one misconception about commercializing in niche regulated markets that you wish investors or strategic partners would better understand? Or how would you remove that misconception?
I can start. So in my opinion, the biggest misconception is that companies think that pediatric markets are too small to matter for their business. But if you look at the history of many pediatric devices, you can see that they often create, other effects into broader populations. So like technologies designed for preterm infants, for example, some of them have shaped standards of care in adult medicine. Things like we talked about yesterday, Kalali, like ECMO and pulse oximetry are two really good examples of how pediatric innovation has rippled out to larger markets. So that's something to keep in mind for the companies reviewing this new technologies for pediatrics.
The other thing is that I think in some cases, and in the case of BARDA, as we dug into the market, we realized that a lot of the competitors were being used off label, and there wasn't really a true indication for pediatrics, but we actually had an indication for pediatrics. So we made people aware of that, and it became an early growth area for us. We originally were more focused on adults, and then we said, wait a minute, this is a great product that can be used with pediatrics, and we're indicated for patients that were 10 kilograms or greater, which is about, I can't remember, 1 or 2 year old patients or older. And so we went after that market and really focused on pediatrics and the VA also, but I'll talk about that separately. But with pediatrics, because we were actually indicated, we can go into pediatric hospitals and clinics and say, hey, we're one of the only pediatric indicated, or the only at the time, pediatric indicated patch monitors on the market. And here are some of the biggest pediatric hospitals in the country that are already using it. And it became a huge focus for us and a big growth area, and really drived some of our initial success and market adoption. And if you're getting the product used on pediatrics, it becomes an easier discussion with adults. If it's that intuitive and that user friendly that it can be used on pediatrics, then it typically will translate that it's an easy product to use with adults. And in our case, that was true. And so it really helped us adopt later, even faster in the adult market, having all these pediatric institutions that were using it.
I'd probably add that from a board and an investor's perspective, I think that there, at least from my perspective or my experience, there was a common misconception that just because the device has clinical evidence and it's working, that it's going to be easy to sell. And getting into the hospital is hard. Getting into labor and delivery is hard. Getting into the NICU is incredibly hard. So I wish that there were a better understanding that until somebody has a personal experience in the NICU, they don't really understand how sensitive and fragile these patients are. The other one, which is maybe a little bit of an opposite approach, is I remember going in here in Kansas City with a high net worth family office. We did not get funded, but one of our accelerator building partners did, and she had a cancer drug for your dog. And that was hard for me to swallow. And it made me take a step back and recognize I'm asking for money. I better know my market. I better know my upside. And I need to remove the stigma, like Jules said, that it's just too small to invest in. And knowing that self-awareness going into those meetings really helped me navigate some difficult questions from an addressable market perspective that helped fuel Inara.
Great insights. Thank you so much. I will pause to see if there are any questions from the audience.
Yes, we have a question. How will AI solutions shape how traditional medical device investors look at potential investments and the market at large? Will it bring a different type of investor class into the space?
I think if you look at the percentage of dollars venture money going into AI startups in healthcare, it is a significant percentage of the dollars. And so you're starting to see a lot more of the traditional devices and device company startups becoming AI-enabled devices, or partnering with AI companies to integrate AI into the technologies they built. And I think in doing that, they become more attractive to venture investors now, who seem to be, at least for the time being, very focused on technology that is either pure AI or devices that are AI enabled. So I think if you're an emerging startup and you don't have a strategy for AI, you're completely missing the boat, in my opinion.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience? No? All right. Maybe one of the closing questions is to ask each of you if you have any advice for the entrepreneurs who are listening and the companies in BARDA's Accelerator program focused on pediatrics and special populations. Your advice could be, from all phases of the product life cycle.
My advice would be to identify your top 10 targets and understand the differences between each facility and how your value proposition can solve problems would be one, just because of the influence from a pediatrics perspective, I think it can't be understated. And there are a host of resources available from an accelerator perspective, from any of the PDIs. There are a number of resources that we took advantage of that helped inform our process. And I would encourage everybody to take advantage of as many of those opportunities as possible.
Right. Thank you. Kamran, there is a question from John and one more question. Would you read those?
John, you can unmute and ask your question live.
Oh, okay. I can read it. John San will
John, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead,
This
John.
question was specifically for Kenneth. I think your product kind of falls in line with our product as well. You have a patch that can detect radiation in real time, and then we can essentially push that into whatever platform for the use case. We're focused primarily in pediatrics right now, but in terms of the we're able to provide you that platform. Can you talk a little bit about that journey?
I think I missed part of the question there. Did everybody else miss that, or?
John, I think your audio is breaking up, but I'll read through the question that you put in the Q&A box. Can you share a bit more about your perspective on the pivot from being strictly a medical device company to becoming more of a service provider? I'm particularly interested in how investors typically view that transition in terms of scalability, recurring revenue models, and overall risk-reward profile.
Yeah, so there was a hesitancy to get into the IDTF model, the Independent Diagnostic Testing Facility model, because it's expensive, it's complex, and the hiring people to review the data or review ECG strips is a niche area, and so building that out wasn't easy. So they tried their best to avoid it. But in avoiding it, they were avoiding 80% of the market. And so making that shift, as difficult as it was to acquire one, it definitely took time and effort to convince the board that was and the board was, a lot of investors were on the board. So investors and the board were almost one and the same for us, and like many startups. And so we had to convince them that the extra time, effort, and dollars that going into that and making the transition was the right thing to do. So it will take time and effort to do it, but at the end of the day, it was the right decision, and that's what fueled our growth. And so it's a good case study to look at if you're trying to convince them to make that shift. The other thing is that the practices are so overwhelmed with work right now that outsourcing that to a third party was actually really appealing and made sense once you described it to the board and walk them through it. So I think looking at cardiac monitoring as an example and a case study might help you build your case.
Thank you. All right, we're almost at time. Did we answer all the questions from the chat, Kamran?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you all the panelists for so candidly sharing your experiences, and thanks for everyone who joined us today. And everything is recorded and will be posted on SPARK's website. Huge thanks again, and see you soon.
All right,
Thank
thanks so
you.
much.
Bye all. Thank you.